I want to thank everyone who joined us for the second session of this collaboration between the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies and Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. While a ceasefire deal between Israel and Iran may have been reached earlier this week, there is certainly a lot more left to discuss and analyze with respect to the war and Iran's future, which is why I'm personally excited to hear each and every one of our featured speakers today. Two quick things before we start. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, which will be answered during the Q&A at the end of this event, and also for the first three speakers, they might be answered earlier, so don't forget to ask using that feature. And I would also like to add that the recording of the first session, which took place yesterday, is already available on the Alliance Center YouTube channel, so in case you missed that, it's there for you to watch. Now, without further ado, I welcome Professor David Menashri to open our webinar. David, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. And to save time, let me introduce briefly the people. I think most of them are well known to the audience here. The first speaker will be Professor Itamar Rabinovich. He was basically established the Eyal Center for Middle Eastern Studies and African Studies. He was Israeli ambassador to Washington, D.C., and I think he was also chief negotiator in our with Syria in the 90s. Please, Itamar.
Thank you, David. So let me talk about U.S. policy in this recent crisis, and I will try to put it in two perspectives. The one, I'll speak about it briefly, is the bilateral American-Iranian relationship, or rather hostility or enmity from 1979 on, analyzed and presented very well in 1988, I think, in James Beall's book, The Eagle and the Lion. And it's a very deep and difficult relationship or hostility, because hostility to America and to Israel is embedded deeply in the nature of this regime. It helps define it, and it's very difficult to overcome it as long as this regime is in power. The second, more immediate perspective begins in 2009. Two persons come to power early in 2009. One is Barack Obama as President of the United States, and the other is Netanyahu, who in the aftermath of the elections forms a cabinet, a government, and comes back to power after several years of being away from power. And Netanyahu turns the threat of the Iranian nuclear into his main issue. He wants to be seen and remembered as the man or the leader who saved Israel from this mortal Iranian threat. He entertains military action in 2010, 2012. There are several. Israel spends quite a bit of money on exercises, maneuvers that seem like a preparation for this attack. Whether it was meant to be carried out or whether it was a tactic, not so much to frighten the Iranians, but to frighten the Obama administration that Israel might attack and then draw the United States in, and therefore encourage the United States to engage seriously in dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat, which ultimately leads to the JCPOA, which from Netanyahu's point of view is a disappointment, although, if I may say, was not a perfect, not a very good agreement, but a satisfactory agreement. And that was the culmination of the Obama administration's policy on this issue. Then comes Trump, and Trump, during his first term, is actually quite mild on Iran. The Iranians shot down a very sophisticated American drone, there was no response. The Iranians and proxies inflicted heavy damages on Saudi oil installations. There was no response. Then came Biden. Biden tried to revive the negotiations and failed. He failed because he was too mild, and he and his people did not really adopt the negotiating technique that must be or can be efficient when you deal with a very skillful, sophisticated, experienced Iranian negotiators. It failed without any impact, and then Trump was reelected. And here, three major developments led to the United States actually joining Israel in the war on Iran and destroying, bombing three very significant sites in Iran. The three are these. One is Trump himself. We could spend the whole time talking about the peculiarities of Trump, but there he is with his unpredictability, his refusal or failure to work with staff. He is the decision maker, and he does his way. And the second one is that Netanyahu and Dermer, his negotiator, figured out how to press the right buttons with Trump. And the third was the error, the mistake of the Iranian regime, negotiated several rounds in Oman with Mr. Witkoff, the American negotiator. They were not serious about it. They did not take Trump or the prospect of an American resort to violent action seriously. And that was a miscalculation that ultimately led to the United States joining Israel in this campaign, launching B-2 stealth bombers and destroying to some extent at least three very significant nuclear sites. And then President Trump forced a ceasefire. I think he forced a ceasefire because he knew, he understood indirectly from the Iranians that they were going to be more flexible this time. We don't know how flexible, but more flexible. That there was a prospect of returning to negotiations and coming out with an agreement that he can possibly or could possibly present as better than the JCPOA, and that's why he forced a ceasefire and was quite brutal and ruthless about the way he did it. So the next phase that we are going to witness now, in my estimate, is a return to negotiations. We don't know how flexible the Iranians are going to be. We don't know how willing Trump and his people are willing to be in order to come out of this with an agreement. But this is probably going to unfold over some time. I expect the Iranians to have learned from their failure last time and not to antagonize Trump or to send him into a point at which he would feel that he was deceived, and then choose to act again. And this is my scenario for the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you, Itamar. Before we go on, I just ask Arnold if he's hearing me, that to turn on the camera to be on the panel here with your nice face. Now, thank you. It's going now one step to look from inside Iran. Professor Abbas Milani, that he's coordinator of Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution and director of Iranian Studies at Stanford. He also had the pleasure, or not pleasure, to spend some time in Evin jail under the Shah, and was called for a brief meetings in Evin jail under the Islamic Republic. So you have experience from both sides, please.
Thank you very much. I must apologize in advance because I need to leave a little early. That's only because I was invited to join this conference rather belatedly. Otherwise, I would have obviously, with eagerness, stayed for the entire time. So I'll stay as long as I can, but I have another engagement that I need to go to. I'm very honored to be invited to speak at this event. I've been at the university a couple of times, and it was always a pleasure and a learning experience. It might seem rather strange to talk about democracy in Iran at a time where the regime is one of the most despotic anywhere in the world, most concentrated in one person, where sovereignty for the people doesn't exist. It exists for Allah. But I think Iran is, arguably in my view, maybe the most, at the societal level, the most ready for a transition to democracy. But transition to democracy doesn't happen just because the society wants it. It has many other conditions for this transition to happen. There are several forms that this transition can happen. I want to talk a little bit about why I think Iran is ready for democracy and why it is, in my view, in the Muslim world, the most ready, in fact, for this transition. They say the past is never dead. It's not even the past. That's true about Iran, in the sense that the quest for democracy in Iran has been at least 150 years old. In a sense, you could say that it began when an Iranian woman named Hulata took off her veil and began to deliver a sermon and began a discourse on freedom, a discourse on democracy, and this discourse on gender equality. You could say it's actually much older than this. I think one of the great debates in Iran over the last 150 years has been about whether democracy and a larger question, but connected question, whether modernity is indigenous to Iran, is good for Iran, it's possible in Iran. From conservative clergy who have been an enemy of modernity, who have taken some of their lessons from Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, Mr. Khamenei specifically, to articulate a very cogent, but in my view, false narrative about how modernity is incompatible with Iran. Modernity is essentially a crusader trick. Secularism is a trick to undermine Islam. But I think both modernity and democracy have deep roots in Iranian culture. They go back maybe to the biblical time, from the Cyrus episode that people in this conference clearly at least have read about, to 3 centuries of discourse in Iran, indigenous discourse in Iran, from people like Sa'di, from people like Avicenna, who have the very early gem of modern society, talk about rationalism, talk about human rights. 300 years before humanism and human rights become a part of modernity's discourse in the West, we have people like Sa'di in Iran. And I'm not just talking about his one poem everyone quotes. I've written a book about Sa'di and humanism with a colleague, and you could see that there is this base. And in the last 150 years, that has continued to exist. In the Islamic Republic, I think the way I see the most important elements of this democracy, of this democratic movement, is again at the societal level. I have argued often that the most cogent, the most prudent, the most successful civil disobedience movement of the last 40 years has been organized by Iranian women in fighting the hijab. It takes a great deal of democratic savvy to do that. Iranian society today, people in Iran today, women in Iran today, the youth in Iran today don't live the life of an Islamic state. They don't live a life as Mr. Khamenei and his cohorts wish, but they have created, again, what in political science some have called heterotopias. These small societal level experiments in democracy, in civil society, in organization, in fighting the regime, whether it is fighting its censorship, whether it's fighting its hijab laws, whether it is recognizing the rights of religious others to exist. At no time in the last 150 years, for example, have people at the societal level recognized the right of Baha'is to live in Iran, or recognized the right of Iranian Jews to be co-equals. Clearly, there are sentiments, anti-Semitic sentiments, but the society at the level of everyday existence. I think the Iranian democratic forces, which are, to me, in Iran, and they are the main opposition to this regime. I think one of the fallacies that we often find in some of the discussions about Iran is to think that the opposition or the democratic opposition of Iran are those who are in the West and talk the talk of democracy and present themselves as the opposition. I think the opposition in Iran is inside Iran. It is people who have been fighting this regime incrementally. They have created a de facto revolution, I think, in Iran. And I don't say this now. Again, I wrote about this, an article called Iran's Incremental Revolution several years ago. All you need to do is watch Iranian society and see that at the societal level, people live a life very different from every edict of the regime. The regime wants people to have 12 children. People have less than 2. Even in the city of Qom, the epicenter of Shiite theology, people don't listen to the regime's dogmas, but practice their own lives. And their own lives are these heterotopias for democracy. And some of the regime's own elements, remarkably, have recognized that the game is up. You can see very strong opposition to Mr. Khamenei's dogmas coming from within the regime. You see elements of the IRGC engage in, for example, publication of censored books, publication of banned films. These are recognitions that Iran has moved away from this dogma. 2 days ago, I was watching an interview with Mr. Jalili, the brother of the infamous Jalili who wanted to be the president. This gentleman is the deputy director of Iran's radio and television. And he, in the interview, says, some of our brothers, clearly he's not talking about me or people in this room, he's talking about people in Iran. He says, some of our brothers are saying, in Iranian television, we should no longer use the name Allah. We should no longer say Bismillah. He says, they tell us in order to create a national unity, we need to have a different discourse. And he himself in this 3-minute discourse never mentioned Islam once. Mr. Khamenei's discourse that yesterday or this morning, saying that he's won the war, that the world is at his beck and call, and everybody begged him to accept a ceasefire, almost never mentions Islam. It's Iran. His other discourse on this, his other talk on this, mentioned Iran 22 times. This is somebody who always said patriotism is, again, a crusader's trick. So at the societal level, public discourse and public sentiment, I think, has moved away from this regime, demands democracy, recognizes pluralism, recognizes doubt. Hannah Arendt tells us that the foundation for democracy is accepting ambiguity in human affairs. People, I can quote you, people from Qom saying that in Qom, the madrasas of Qom, relativism and doubt have become more prominent than religious dogma. That is the opposition to this regime. That is what I think will determine the future of Iran. Again, I began by quoting Faulkner, let me end by quoting Shakespeare. It says, the past is but an epilogue. We have a prologue to the future. It's not an epilogue, it's a prologue to the future. I think the prologue is for a democratic Iran. It's not an easy process. This regime still has a great deal of violence left in it, but I think it is a spent force in terms of being incongruent with what the majority of the Iranian people want. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of people here, and the first session yesterday dealt with some aspect of what Abbas said, but I think that it adds to better understanding the complexity of Iranian society and politics. And thank you, Abbas. Just want, if I mention something that about the Iranian people, that they, the book we have by Hannah Arendt, Banality of Evil, became a bestseller in Iran because they made equation between Nazi Germany and Raisi as president. So that's a society which is always surprising. The next speaker is Eyal Hulata. He's a former National Security Council, head of National Security Council. I just learned today that he and Meir have something in common, except for, in addition to knowing each other, they are related to Iran through their mothers. And I also learned that he grew up in the town that I grown up, and it's a compliment in Rishon LeZion, and he went to the same high school, but more or less with my son. So that's different generations, but it's please.
David, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the compliments. And hello, Meir, and other friendly faces, Professor Rabinovich, Michael. Good to see you all. So the aspect I was asked to talk about was the nuclear program itself. So I will start by giving my perspective on the heated debates that we're experiencing about what exactly happened, what do we know, and what we should expect in the future, and then maybe a little bit about what are the options that Iran will have vis-a-vis their nuclear program in the future, and how we should respond to it. From an Israeli perspective, of course, there could be also an American perspective. I won't go into all of the details of the program. Those of you who know this will know, and the others, I don't have the time to elaborate all of the various parts of it, but just to make a few, I think, important observations. The first is, we were always talking about the core of the program, which is the enrichment program to produce enriched uranium, ultimately highly enriched uranium of 90%. Iran has accumulated so far quite a lot of material, 60%, 20%, 3.5%, and they've done so in two major facilities, in Natanz and in Fordo. I think the damage to this cycle of enrichment is very significant as it comes to the facilities themselves, and I'm pretty sure that when the final battle damage assessment will come out, both on what Israel has done in Natanz and the centrifuge production facilities and so forth, and on the attack the Americans have done on Fordo, we will see that the damage is substantial, and that these facilities are inoperable. I'm quite certain of it. I think it's very clear, even when looking at satellite imagery so far, and intel will accumulate. Why is this such a heated discussion, and why do CNN, New York Times put out excerpts of a DIE report claiming otherwise? We have our own issues with how things are leaked to the press and how this is politicized in Israel. I will leave that debate to the Americans to explain how this happens. But I believe that when things will unravel, we will see that the JAMAS was good. But this is not true to the stockpile. The stockpile itself is probably, even if it is damaged, and I hope it is, and I hope that most of the containers are buried under rubble, either in Fordo or in Isfahan or in Natanz, it is quite eminent, and we definitely need to operate with the assumption that Iran is able already, maybe, or in the future, to salvage significant amounts of enriched uranium from this settings. They will not be able to enrich it to highly enriched uranium in Fordo Natanz because they were damaged, but because they also have significant numbers of centrifuges stashed in various places. If they want to do this, they could build a new enrichment facility somewhere in a tunnel, not in a tunnel, and to fulfill the enrichment job if they want to. This is the risk that we're running at the moment. And this is, I think, potentially to deal with that in full in a military strike would have been very difficult. Professor Rabinovich alluded before that to the JCPOA. We may disagree about how bad it was. Maybe I think it was worse, with your permission, Professor, but for sure, the significant thing that happened with JCPOA is that it removed the stockpiles that Iran has accumulated until that point and took it out of the country, deposited elsewhere. It allowed them the capability to do it again, as indeed they were able to, but the stockpiles, to deal with them, someone needs to take the containers physically, and that is very difficult to do just in a military strike. However, the other element that was done to the nuclear program, which I think is not reported enough and a bit overlooked, is the precision attacks, both of the people and of the facilities, of the weaponization program. We've not been talking enough about the weaponization program. This is a piece that JCPOA almost entirely overlooked, except one section that was never really meant to be implemented, because maybe 10, 13 years ago, people thought it was far and we could deal with this later. Well, later has come. And what we understand, and I'm sure that we'll see more and more reporting coming out of it, is that there were indications, clear indications, that the Supreme Leader has understood that given his strategic position at the moment, he should start creeping towards the work also on the weaponization program. And this is very significant from an Israeli perspective, because it means that this buffer of about a year, maybe two, that it would take Iran to build a bomb after they have, or once they have, the enriched uranium itself, this part of the work was supposed to be a buffer that would give us the safety mechanism. Well, this is true as long as the Supreme Leader does not approve work in the weaponization program. We can debate what happened over the last 20 years. We learned a lot about the weaponization program from the archive that we retrieved from Iran in the beginning of 2018. But my understanding is that this is not just a talk coming out in the outside and not just narratives. There were indications that they were making significant steps to start diminishing this time on the weaponization. And this is why the attack on the weaponization group was so important. The scientists, the facilities, the laboratories, their ability to convert uranium back to metal, which is significant to make a bomb. All of the experts that have done hands-on work on this issue until 2003, most of these expertise and most of these facilities and capabilities are gone because of the precision strike that Israel has done on June 12th. And the significance of that is that even if Iran decides that they will take the enriched stockpile and the centrifuges that they have and enrich to 90%, now they need to build a bomb. And they do not have the capabilities to do that. This is not something that they've done routinely. The Supreme Leader will need to trust that people who are not first grade at it, who are not participating in the work that was done under Ahmad until 2003, Fakhrizadeh is not there, his replacement is not there, the top scientists are not there. Can he trust them to build a bomb that will be relevant as deterrence? I think this is the dilemma that the Supreme Leader will be in. This is a very, I think, significant achievement of the strike that we have done. Now, toward the future, and I'm cognizant of the time, I'll finish very quickly. We will need, I'm saying as Israel, to keep a very close eye on what Iran will do from now on. Maybe this will transform into a new negotiating agreement. As Professor Rabinovich said, I hope so. And that Trump will stand on the principles that Iran should not have the ability to enrich uranium in the future and to rebuild their program. But whether or not this happens, the Israel intelligence will need to keep a close eye on what they're doing, where the stockpiles are, where the scientists are, what kind of avenues are they starting to develop. Because I believe that as long as this regime is there, their ambition and their vision to build a bomb and to be able to threaten Israel in an existential way is significant and real. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hulata. And I think it's added another elements that we speak about Iran, and this we don't understand much in the nuclear thing, but I think that with your additional, what you added is important. Yesterday we heard Professor New York that spoke about the nuclear. He's professor of physics. And then I think, again, we have to listen to all this to combine and draw conclusion. The next speaker is Dr. Sanam Vakil. Sanam Vakil is the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Chatham House. And she's working very hard to educate people what is Iran in the recent years, but mainly since the war. Please, Sanam.
Thank you, David. It's good to see you and to see many colleagues and friends online. Thank you for having me. And sorry I was not able to join you yesterday. I'm also not able to stay too long, unfortunately, due to other commitments. But happy to share some initial reflections as to the Iranian state, or where it is, the state of the Iranian state, and where I see it might be going. This is all just very speculative, unfortunately, because it's still very early days. I think the Iranian state, in my view, has been in transition already for quite some time. Certainly, this war is likely to accelerate a lot of what that transition will look like. Already since October 7th and the war across the region, Iran has been debating its strengths and weaknesses, as its weaknesses have been made very clear. Its defense doctrine and strategy has effectively collapsed. Its reliance on militias as part of its forward defense certainly been about projecting power rather than really building foundation to really strike and protect Iran so far from Iran's borders. Obviously, its missile and drones, and relying on its asymmetrical defense. There'll be a debate on it, the strengths and weaknesses of that program, but relying on that sort of asymmetry on its own is certainly not enough to provide a sophisticated defense strategy. And of course, what remains of its nuclear program is to be determined. But it's worthwhile just noting that in 2024 already there was much more of a public debate and discussion about the value of Iran's nuclear program, and the concept of weaponization became an issue that was discussed more publicly, perhaps to normalize it, perhaps to use the threat of weaponization in its dialogue with Europe, if not with the United States. But nevertheless, that has been normalized in the public domain. And I think, of course, coming out of this war, but certainly this was already evident far before the war, not just in 2024 with the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, but going back to Fakhrizadeh and the killing of nuclear scientists, and of course Israeli activities inside Iran for quite some time. Iran certainly has significant intelligence breaches, and its structure is very penetrated. So, how do I see the Iranian state? I'm bored by writing again that, Iran is in its legitimacy crisis. I've been writing this now for so long that I'm not particularly motivated by that narrative. But it certainly has a governance crisis. And I think it's important that the state itself is acknowledging the governance crisis that it is facing, not just because of its limited defense capabilities or the strikes or the war, but certainly it is in a bind of its own making. And Dr. Milani, of course, has sort of laid out the very obvious challenges it faces across its very dynamic factionalized, perhaps pluralistic society. I'm not convinced that Iran is on the path to democracy, although it would certainly be fantastic as an outcome. I'm pretty convinced that Iranians, have a sense of what they don't want. I'm not 100% certain that Iranians know what they want. But, certainly this war will precipitate a more public discussion as to what Iranians want. And I think as a consequence of the war, Iranians are aware that external players, be it Israel or the United States, but also external actors in the diaspora, shouldn't be driving or defining the internal governance structure of Iran. And that is one point I would like to make. It hopefully will precipitate more internal discussion on what comes next. To my second point, in terms of Iran being in transition, I think we're going to see a faster change in the face of the system or the regime. If I want to be catchy, what does that mean? Of course, we don't know. There are a number of scenarios out there, and it all is very much connected to how Iran handles its diplomatic tracks with the multiple parties that are out there. But I think this war is going to fast track changes. That change can come in a number of scenarios and circumstances, many of which that have already been discussed in the public domain, whether they're public constitutional processes that the system would like to maintain. It's worthwhile noting last week that Khamenei did bring up this issue of succession as the hysteria over regime change became very loud. So, the constitutional process is certainly there. It's worthwhile also considering its past experience of transition in 1989 and what that process did or did not bring. I think above all, that process showcases the possibility for constitutional reform inside the country. And there are a number of scenarios of what that might look like. Prior, a number of years ago, when there were more public discussions on change in the regime, there were debates about strengthening Iran's parliament, also debates about canceling Iran's parliament. But, nevertheless, there can be a constitutional reform process that could move the institutions around and perhaps strengthen the Republican side of the Islamic Republic. I do very much share Professor Milani's analysis that the Islamic Republic is moving away from Islam into more of a republic. We can perhaps say that this will be the third republic, but it won't be, as reliant on Islamic ideology. But certainly, again, the war is accelerating features and facets that we've already seen across Iran, including from the Iranian leadership itself, that the system is relying much more on nationalism and territorial integrity and sovereignty as a basis of legitimacy and resistance. What comes next, I think, will be certainly post-Islam and much more about Iran. And of course, that narrative has played out over the past 12 days. And I think this is an opportunity to pivot away from an ideology that doesn't resonate across the broad and diverse population in Iran. So in that context of constitutional reform, obviously bolstering the Republican side, it seems obvious. You could have a nominal supreme leader or, someone who is just a guide. You could have a council put back into the constitution. So there are many scenarios there that certainly could emerge. And obviously there's a third outcome where there is internal consensus reached at or a push of sorts, and the regime transforms in through a coup or through a sort of coalescence around a particular individual. Hard to see who that might be right now, but there's certainly a number of candidates in the system that recognize Iran's isolation, which is profound, and this war has certainly highlighted that. It can't go unnoticed. It's certainly a number of key figures recognize that Iran's economic crisis is certainly profound. The country has not had serious growth since before the JCPOA. The sanctions have led to 80% of the middle class being impoverished, and the unsustainability of development in Iran remains a real challenge. And I would add, of course, that the social contract effectively is broken and doesn't exist. So, against that backdrop, I would also say that at the same time, the Islamic Republic is a bureaucratized institutional regime. So, all of this hysteria that the regime was going to collapse over the past 12 days, I thought was slightly fanciful and misplaced, and a misunderstanding of the nature of the Islamic Republic that is fierce and strong, really because it didn't abolish the monarchical institutions, but built upon them, to use sort of Tocqueville's analogy. And if you just look at the sheer numbers of people in that bureaucracy and institutions, which I will throw out there, 2.6 million civil servants, 190,000 members in the IRGC, 150,000 members of the Basij, 1 million reservists, 420,000, these are estimates, of course, people in the army or Artesh, law enforcement forces, 300,000, 30,000 in their very sort of fragile intelligence services. That is a very large bureaucracy. And holding together that bureaucracy is very hard. Driving consensus in that bureaucracy is also important. And breaking that bureaucracy is also very difficult. So in the context of sheer data and numbers alone, what does Iran face? Very quickly, because of time, a number of scenarios I would see, none of them particularly promising. And sorry for the noise outside. There is that typical 1989 poison chalice scenario to draw upon, where the system takes a deal in order to preserve either this version or the next iteration of what comes next. And there is, perhaps leadership change. As we saw in 1989, the focus is on survival, perhaps hardening in terms of nationalism. But certainly we're already seeing a sample of the purges and the roundup across the country against potential people that supported or have engaged with Israel. And through this, we could see a change with regards to governance and an effort to obtain sanctions relief. This is a bit fanciful, I think, to imagine from Ali Khamenei, who is particularly mistrustful, and hard to imagine considering the international landscape and the lack of real decisive leadership, I think, globally. But that is, one way forward. I think, of course, a second way forward, bleaker scenario for Iran, if there is no deal, is looking at a post-Iraq 1991 scenario, where the West in particular, looks to enforce disarmament, further sanctions, restrict Iran's military movements, and rebuilding capabilities. There is a protracted standoff with Western governments, the United Nations, and a similar sort of strategy of protracted conflict, if not attrition, against the Islamic Republic. And I think that is a scenario that the system knows is out there, and they will be looking to try to avoid at all costs. And thirdly, we should look at 2003 and how Iran managed two wars on its doorstep. Of course, it wasn't directly engaged in a war, but how the system tried to navigate through this neither peace nor war, but a muddle through, which is, I don't think, a successful strategy for Iran or its people, but one that the regime tends to go for when it can't make deep concessions and when it wants to avoid total surrender. What that will look like, I think we have to play out a bit further, but that sort of hunkering down approach, perhaps investing much more in its relations across the region, while Iran is isolated from the West and certainly does not have strong or meaningful relations with Russia, if not China. Its regional ties are its best bet. And ironically, as a result of sanctions and a result of many years of tensions in the region, it is far more normalized in the Middle East as an actor than Israel is. And so I throw that out there to you as a final sort of provocation of sorts. The region is very united in preventing further war, preventing the collapse of the Islamic Republic, and that could be the muddle through that Iran tries to leverage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before we go on, I think we should pause it for a moment because the four first speakers say that they'll have to leave shortly. And I'm glad that three of them are still here. And if there are any question addressed to them, or there is any comment that people in the panel have to each other, this is time. Eyal, there are any questions?
No, there aren't any questions in the Q&A right now.
Okay. Is there any comment that you want to make here on each other's talk? I'll make one comment. It's just not related to anything that has been said here. We should always remember that we know only what we know. There are so many unknown elements that it makes it speaking about scenarios and what will be in the future. I say on behalf of all of us, because we speak and there are things that we don't know.
Yeah. Can I say something just before?
Yes.
Because I have an appointment at 9 o'clock. I think
9 o'clock is in California.
Well, yes, I'm in California, unfortunately.
Yes.
That's where I live. I wish it was Esfahan. But anyway, I think in thinking about what might happen, in a sense, we have to recognize, at least in my view, this is a regime at its weakest. This is not a regime in 1980 that could mobilize masses in its own support. When I say it is at its weakest, I don't mean to accept the notion that Dr. Vakil was referring to in some of the euphorias in the opposition, that this regime is about to fall, let's reserve the next ticket back to Tehran. This is a regime that is more tactically resilient and brutal, but is strategically profoundly weak at this moment. And many of the options it had in the past, I don't think it's any longer available to it. And part of what they were looking for in this deal, and I think to some extent they got it, is a deal that accepts defeat but sells it as victory. They needed to be able to tell the world and their base that we didn't completely give in, that we won this war. And essentially, that's what they negotiated for. That's what Khamenei's most recent announcement reflects. But I think deep down they know, and many people in the regime know, that the game in the status quo is up. They need to reinvent themselves, I think, in order to survive. And they, I think, recognize that unless they bring in a massive amount of, for example, investment, the economy is going to collapse. I watched a tape of a meeting with the leadership of the Majlis, where one entrepreneur inside Iran said, you know, you keep talking, you keep boasting, you keep bluffing, but I know the economy is about to collapse. I live in this country, he said. He said, we need $700 billion to get this economy to where it was 5 years ago. Where are you going to get that money from? They can only get it if they accept peace, if they accept coalescence, as Dr. Vakil was saying, a large coalescence of forces around one idea, I think. A democratic, inclusive, rational Iran that moves away from the dogmas of Mr. Khamenei to what the people seem to want: peaceful, reasonable, sovereign, independent state. And I think one that can easily give up the enrichment program. Just for one last point, I wrote an article with Professor Sig Hacker 12 years ago, where we argued that if Iran really wants a peaceful nuclear program, they should give up enrichment. They should go the path of South Korea. That article is there. It was translated into Farsi. It was to be published in Itamar, and in the last minute, the security forces said no. So that debate has been percolating under the surface, that why do we go for enrichment and put the entire country on the verge of collapse if we indeed don't want to build the bomb? They do want to build the bomb. That's why they didn't accept it then, but I think now they might not have an option. Apologies, I have a 9 o'clock appointment. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was an honor to be on the panel with this wonderful, brilliant group of scholars.
Thank you. Sanam, do you want to add something?
I don't, but just to thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to continuing the conversation and the discussion, hopefully in person.
Can I ask you before you leave? I see in many reports and surveys in Iran that speak about the distance that people are taking young people from religion, and the figures are unbelievable. I mean, far more than 50% support the separation of religion and state. And this is in the office of the president of the state. And the immigration from Iran is really, they are very concerned about it, how many people live, and they're trying to bring people from Afghanistan to compensate from people who don't go to the church, to the mosque, and they bring them. Do you how serious are these issues?
I don't know about bringing Afghans to fill the mosques. I would have to see that to believe it. But I do know that the mosques are generally empty. There is a disenchantment, obviously, with the imposition of religious ideology, particularly among younger people. And there are higher statistics of atheism, higher conversions to other religions. So that is quite regular trend line that we're seeing in Iran. What does that mean? I think certainly I'm someone that celebrates the possibility of seeing a secular government in Iran, and I think that people are quite cynical about the instrumentalization of religion by the state and by the clergy. And so you've also seen like videos and just general reporting about this disrespect to the clerical class. But I would just also caution, and you know this, David, very well. I mean, a nationalist Iran isn't a great outcome either, particularly if it's a nationalist military Iran, or a governance structure that consolidates around one person. And I sort of remind people regularly that a monarchical Iran, wasn't like a sedate, it was an active, regionally ambitious player in and across the Middle East. Even the Pahlavis were that way. So, whatever comes next isn't going to really alter, in my mind, the way Iran engages in the region. If the hope is that Iran is just going to sit by itself, I don't think so. I mean, Iranian history doesn't really point to that. That's sort of my take of what comes next isn't necessarily going to be better. It's going to be different. I'll stop there because I don't have more to say. But good to see you all.
I'll send you a reference to articles about immigration, but I suggest to all of us to watch for Saturday. This is the Ashura. And see how this
July
is
5th, I believe, no?
Excuse me? It's
July
Friday?
5th. July 5th. Not this.
July 5th.
I think it's this, July 5th.
Okay, you put Ashura 2025 and you'll get you the name. For some reason, I thought it's Saturday. And see if they are able to mobilize that many people to the streets and how they use the situation to indoctrinate people.
But I mean, I will just say this. Back when I used to go to Ashura in Iran, just to see what people were doing, it was a social gathering. I mean, young people were going to Ashura to exchange numbers and flirt.
When is it? When is it?
This was the last time I saw this was in 2009. This was before the elections.
So I'll tell you what I saw during the Shah's regime. And I was there 2 or 3 times. It was so frightening, the ecstasy of people. And this was in the 70s. So part of the answer is what you say. It's really changed. And I don't think about the early 80s. Thank you. We have to move on. Thank you, Sanam. The army was mentioned here. Revolutionary Guards hardly, but we have Dr. Michael Eisenstadt, and he will speak about Iranian military and the war. Michael is a senior associate in the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Studies.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Meir, for the invitation to speak at this Alliance Center webinar. And I just want to say that I'm especially honored to be on a panel with so many people whose works have played such a formative role in my own intellectual development. So thank you. And I just want to just state one thing. I'm not a doctor, even though my parents never got over that, but I've learned to live with the fact. So I'm just a mister. But anyhow, but thank you for the promotion. Let me just start with a comment about Iran's trajectory. If you look back in the last 46 years or so, and especially the last 25 years, Iran has gone from being a strategically lonely state to the leader of the region's most capable and cohesive bloc, the so-called axis of resistance, which it built from scratch, which was in itself a very impressive achievement, in part as a result of mistakes that the United States made, but also as a result of perseverance and the investment of tremendous resources in this effort. They also went from a state that was encircled by its enemies. If you remember, 25 years ago, we had, or 23 years ago, we had the U.S. Army in Afghanistan, the U.S. Army in Iraq. We had the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf. And there were all these reports about Israel and Azerbaijan. So they were a state that saw themselves encircled by their enemies to a state that encircled its enemies with this ring of fire, both not just Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And they went from being a state that was an isolated nuclear pariah state to a nuclear threshold state that other states in the region were in the process of accommodating to. And we've seen the kind of reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and the UAE. I think as part before the war, as part of an effort to kind of accommodate themselves to a rising Iran. Now, as a result of Operation Rising Line, things have almost come full circle. Let me just say, and I want to emphasize the almost. We're not there yet, but the proxies, as we all know, Hezbollah is a shadow of its former self. Iran still has the Iraqis and the Houthis, but they are far from the front when it comes to Israel. Of course, they have the ability to put pressure on the United States, but the ability to do so is limited, because now that the United States and Israel have shown that they're willing to take the war to Iran, the calculus has changed. And again, their airspace is vulnerable, and the nuclear program is a shadow of its former self. A few comments about Iran's hybrid, unbalanced force structure. So Iran has, by regional standards, kind of a reasonably large military. About 1,500 tanks in the ground forces. You have actually, not a very large navy, but within the Persian Gulf, very capable of fulfilling its sea and Nile role. And what's really important, though, is what I call the deterrent warfighting triad of Iran, which consists of its proxies, at least in the past, long-range strike systems such as drones and missiles, and its navy. And as a result of the war, of course, I mentioned the proxies are, many of them are no more, greatly diminished. Long-range strike systems have undergone significant attrition as a result of the war. You have about maybe half the missiles through use, as well as attrition by Israeli action. And the Navy, though, is largely untouched. So, but the Navy, they have limits on their ability to use their naval forces, because their trump card, closing the Strait of Hormuz, is a dual-edged sword. And given that Iran imports and exports nearly 90% of its imports and oil through the Strait of Hormuz, this is something this is their Samson option, to use a metaphor from somewhere else. So this is a capability which is this is actually the capability of theirs, which is the most difficult for them to use. They also have problems that there is both structural and conceptual path dependencies. Because they rely so much on missiles, and Israel's missile defenses performed rather well, even despite the difficult blows that they were able to strike. Not a large number of civilians killed in historical standards, but tremendous physical damage to physical infrastructure, and I think psychological impact. But they put tremendous resources into their missile forces. And like I said, they still have some, but the Israelis and the Americans show that they can manage this problem, even if it results still in losses. They also lack the money and the supplies to replenish their losses. They don't have, like the Arabs after the '67 war, the Soviet Union was able to resupply the Egyptian and Syrian armies within a year. Again, like I said, the Iranian losses are not mainly to their conventional forces. It's their deterrent warfighting triad under the IRGC, under the Quds Force, under the aerospace forces, under the IRGC Navy. And again, the Navy is largely intact, but the proxies, I don't know if they'll ever be able to rebuild them, but it will take decades, because it took decades the last time. And the missiles, let me just say, we know from our experience in World War II, after the Gulf War in '91, that they will probably be able to reconstruct some of the capabilities, because a lot of the equipment used for these kind of efforts are very robust. And unless you target them directly, as Israel did last October in Parchin, when they hit the orbital mixers in at the Talagan 2 facility there, not the Talagan 2, excuse me, in Parchin at the missile production facility, unless you hit those particular pieces of equipment, if you knock down buildings, very often the equipment can be pulled out of the rubble. You can cannibalize, from 3 broken pieces of equipment, you get two working pieces of equipment, or 1 working pieces of equipment as a result. So they'll be able to probably reconstruct the missile production capability, but at a much lower level. And they'll have to have much lower production rates in the future if they are able to pull that off. Now, in terms of Iran's national security concept, for decades, they relied on gray zone activities, and there's nothing really kind of so special about their gray zone approach, although they had a uniquely Iranian approach to doing gray zone activities. But anybody who has a younger brother, or when they were growing up, knows what the gray zone is about. Because I'd be doing my homework, and my brother would come to the threshold of my room and stand at the entrance and try to distract me. And then he would step into my room, step back, step into the room deeper, step back, until I ran after him. And then he would, so he would try to see what he could get away with, test my response thresholds. Then I'd be chasing him and he'd scream, "Mom, Dad, Mike's running after me." So he'd play the victim for sympathy and try to get the great powers to, support him. And then he would run into his room and close the door. So he had his anti-access area denial capability kind of set up there. So that's basically, it's based on the universal human psychology, this kind of gray zone approach. And it really worked very well for Iran for a long time. But like Putin in Russia, who also used a gray zone approach in Ukraine, but then eventually gave it up for overt approaches, which was his downfall, or maybe it won't be his downfall, but it was a major mistake. Iran also adopted more direct approaches of confrontation last year with their 2 strikes on Israel in April and October. And you had an attempt by the head of the IRGC, General Hossein Salami, to enunciate this new deterrence concept, to create a new balance with Israel, but saying that any attack on Iran's interests going forward, this was in April of 2024, would meet with a direct attack from Iran. But in October, when the test came, Iran did not act on it, and then they moved forward. And then he moved forward with the nuclear program, and this caused Israel, with regard to weaponization activities, apparently, and this caused Israel to act overtly against Iran with the war. So I assume we're going to go back to the gray zone. Again, people are creatures of habit, and it worked for them for a long time. Maybe they'll engage in inspired terrorism, cheat and retreat type of actions with regard to their nuclear program, like we saw in Iraq in the 1990s. So we might be entering a period of kind of containment with regard to Iran. Maybe there'll be negotiations over Iran's nuclear program because they need sanctions relief, or maybe it won't happen. The question is, with regard to Israel, will be the main enforcer, just like the U.S. Air Force was the main enforcer of UN inspections of Iran in Iraq in the 1990s. Israel will have to play the main role of containing Iran's nuclear program. So the questions are, can the aerial corridor to Tehran be kept open? Can Israeli intelligence, the intelligence architecture, which has been so successful thus far in providing insights into what's going on to Iran, as well as supporting covert action, can that remain viable? And will the U.S. remain engaged, or will it be distracted and lose patience and focus on other priorities? There's also the issue of generational change in the Iranian military and in the political system at large, with the targeted killings of a whole layer of the Iranian command structure. You have new leaders. Will they have the same mindset and same approach to the use of force as their predecessors? Will they be more radicalized as a result of their experience, or more chastened? And what about the IRGC-Artesh balance? Will that change in the future? My final comments about nuclear weapons, I'll just say a lot of people have said that that as a result of the use of force, Iran is more likely to go for the bomb, because they will look around and say that no nuclear country has been attacked, although that's not quite right, because Iran attacked Israel several times. But that they will be more motivated to get the bomb now. And I would simply raise the question, I think it's a valid point, but I simply raise the question of whether the factors which caused Iran to hedge with its nuclear program in the past to avoid a decision on weaponization, whether those factors will remain. And I will just say, look, if the argument is Iran's weakness requires it to get the bomb, I would argue that's the worst time to try to get the bomb, when you are militarily weak. And it's shown that both, Iranian airspace is open to the Israeli Air Force and the U.S. Air Force, as long as they have the intelligence needed to get at whatever is going on. And likewise, Israel has shown that Iran's nuclear program is penetrated, and there's a good chance they would get early warning of an attempt to get the bomb. Maybe it's more useful for Iran to use the leverage of having this latent nuclear capability than actually trying to get the bomb, which again was the whole dynamic which, in the last 23 or so years with their nuclear program. So I would just ask, there's a question in my mind whether they will have to answer these questions. And I think the factors which deterred them in the past and dissuaded them in the past from actually going for the bomb still remain in place. And then there's a question, if they do tried to go for the bomb. Will they go fast or slow? And in Iran, generally, things go slow rather than fast. I could think of a few examples of Iran moving very quickly, as a result of security considerations. But by and large, given their position right now, it might be that they move very slow. There's good reasons for them to move slow. We could discuss it in the Q&A. Anyhow, the bottom line is, and this is my last point, every war gives you a golden hour where the war creates new political military realities. And you have usually a year or 2 or 3 in order to change, in order to lock in a new set of realities through diplomacy and the like. And we'll see. I mean, the United States is doing things in Lebanon, in Syria. There might be things coming out with Saudi Arabia, which helps lock in a new geopolitical reality. On the other hand, never assume that the reality created by a war can last forever. No status is final. And the pendulum of power always swings, and we've seen this after every war. But a lot of it is a function of decisions that will be taken in Washington and in the region in the years to come. So anyhow, that concludes my comments, and I look forward to the following presentations and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The last 2 speakers are our very own Alliance Center for Iranian Studies. I'll introduce them both together, but Dr. Liora Hendelman-Baavur is a senior research fellow at the center, and she's a former director. And her book on the gender in Iran was published by Cambridge University Press and praised all over. And Professor Meir Litvak, he's the head, the director of the center and the previous director of the center. Actually, he succeeded me when I left because the one after me. And his main area of studies is everything in Iran, but mainly I think his strength forte is on the religious aspect of Shiism and also about the Jews of Iran. So Liora, please.
Okay, thank you for the kind words, and I will mostly build up on some of the things that were previously mentioned by both Professor Milani and Dr. Vakil while referring to Iranian civil society. We can say that for civil society in Iran, the achieved ceasefire is not an end, it's an hinge. The direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, 2 weeks of unprecedented missile exchange and other things ended just a couple of days ago. But inside Iran, a very different battle begins. A battle over memory, over control, and over who gets to define what this war meant or means. For civil society, fragmented, surveilled, yet subordinately alive, this moment is filled with contradiction. It is a pause in open conflict, but also a tightening of the domestic grip. The battlefield has moved inward. Iran's civil society has long fluctuated between visibility and suppression. It is made up of journalists, lawyers, students, teachers, cultural producers, and human rights activists and defenders, often working through informal and semi-formal networks. While formal institutions exist, NGOs, students' unions, cultural collectives, they operate under constant pressure. Licenses can be revoked, organizers detained, social media channels blocked, yet civil society survives, not through confrontation, but through adaptation, informal networks, encrypted communication, and persistent everyday defiance. This is especially true in moments of national crisis. Following the Iran-Iraq War, the regime tightened its grip on universities, on women's rights groups, and reformist media, all in the name of ideological consolidation. Similarly, after the 2009 Green Movement, the security apparatus targeted civic groups for allegedly collaborating with foreign powers. And now, after the most intense direct military conflict with Israel, civil society once again faces the risk of being scapegoated. cast as a soft front of infiltration just when the regime needs a new internal enemy. The war's outbreak immediately reactivated a profound ambivalence, especially among activists in exile. In the first hours and days of the escalation, some warned that the war would drag the struggle for freedom a decade backwards, at least. They feared the regime would exploit the conflict to suppress opposition, invoke national unity, and criminalize dissident as betrayal. Others welcomed the precision of the attacks on IRGC and intelligence infrastructure, interpreting them as a rare blow to the state's coercive apparatus. Still others mourned not the regime, but the homeland, shaken by the sight of Iranian soil under fire. These conflicting reactions, expressed in rapid posts, statements, and emotional commentary, revealed not only the strategic differences, but the depth of collective exhaustion and unresolved identity. And yet, in the midst of ambivalence, there were also voices calling for clarity, for unity around the proposition that this regime is irredeemable and that the moment to push for its replacement must not be missed. These debates among activists abroad did not remain confined to the diaspora. Inside Iran, people were watching, often silently, through VPNs in private Telegram groups or whispered conversations. Others absorbed from the rooftops or directly or discreetly filmed scenes from inside cars, sharing videos that captured not only explosions, but reactions, tensions, and everyday life unfolding under threat. The arguments about dignity, betrayal, and opportunity were echoed. They refracted and transformed by those living under immediate threat. As has happened before, the line between inside and outside blurred. Fear traveled outward while urgency traveled in. Women are at the heart of these persistence. They are not only targets of repression, they are often its first responders. From the 1 million signature campaign launched in 2006 to demand legal reforms and challenge discriminatory laws against women, to Women Life Freedom Uprising of 2022 and 2023, women have repeatedly translated personal autonomy into political challenge. These movements, legal in language but revolutionary in implication, pushed against discriminatory laws, state control over the body, and the symbolic erasure of women from public life. In the current post-war moment, and we are just days after, they again face renewed enforcement of hijab laws, surveillance in public spaces, and symbolic marginalization. But they are also the ones who refuse to disappear. This isn't new. In Iran, the body has long been a political battleground, and the female body, its most contested site. The regime governs through visibility, who appears where and how, under what conditions. Women's dress, conduct, and speech become indicators of the state's grip. But those same indicators also become the most potent tools of resistance. Women are at the heart of this persistence, not only, again, as targets of repression, but as its first and most enduring challengers. This is what civil society looks like under pressure, disjoint, but determined, informal, but impactful. It doesn't always look like protest. It often looks like persistence. So the ceasefire has not brought calm. It has redistributed conflict. The question now is not whether the regime will reassert itself. It already has. The question is whether civil society, in all of its fractured and ambivalent forms, can hold its ground long enough to reimagine what comes next. And within this framework, Iranian women are at the front line of reimagining, not because they chose this role, but because the regime assigned it to them. And they have refused to play this role silently. Thank you.
Thank you, Liora. And we move to Meir, who is the last speaker, but I'll ask you, Meir, also to, with your talk, to make the concluding remarks if you want, and thank people that we need to thank them, the participants and others. And with this, we will close because we won't have time to question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will do it. Let me just start by saying that I hope that the analysis which I'm presenting is wrong. Okay. If we talk about durability or resilience of the UN regime, various studies have shown that revolutionary regimes have proven to be much more resilient to popular revolts than any other type of dictatorships. Now, a revolutionary regime is one which had come to power as a result of a mass, violent ideological struggle from below, and its formation was accompanied or based on massive mobilization or participation from below in an effort to completely change state and society. And such regimes often prevailed over civil wars or upon civil wars or attacks from the outside. In the Iranian case, bitter struggle for power right after the success of the revolution, and later the long war against Iraq, or Iraq launched against Iran. Now, a regime is considered revolutionary if the leaders are still the people who had participated in the revolution. In our case, Khamenei and the cohort around him, they still are the people who took part in the 1917 revolution. Now, the resilience of revolutionary regimes rests on four legs. One is the destruction of independent power centers. Second is a strong, cohesive ruling elite, which is hardened by war and violence. Third is tight partisan control over the security forces. And four, powerful coercive apparatuses. Now, these revolutionary legacies help to inoculate or vaccinate the regime against elite defection, military coups, and mass protests. And unfortunately, all four pillars are at work in Iran today. The Iranian regime has effectively eliminated all organized opposition inside Iran, and there is no political or social group like the clergy or the bazaar under the Shah that can organize and mobilize mass action against the regime. The Iran-Iraq war did not only harden the regime's sense of siege and belligerent point of view, but also enabled it to use extremely harsh measures to eliminate all opposition. The Iran ruling elite has never been monolithic, and it was always beset by internal disagreements. Now, it is true also that the social base of the regime is not narrower today than in the past, but there are three factors that, in my way, consolidate its cohesion despite internal disagreements. One is that the ruling elite in Iran knows that its physical and economic survival rests on the existence of the regime. They have no place to go, and many of them are afraid that they will pay with their lives if the regime falls. Secondly, the current war with Israel rallied all the factions within the establishment. Former reformists, liberals, etc., rallied behind the regime, including former Speaker of Parliament Kerubi, who was, for instance, in housing arrest for 15 years. And again, it may be temporary, but it is a fact. And secondly, the regime has built a huge network of patronage. What Dr. Sanam Vakil mentioned before, huge networks of patronage, which tie probably several million people to the system and have a vested interest in the survival of the system. Now, these factors mean that the ruling elite is ruthless and will fight for its survival, and this factor is known among the people and serve as a deterrence. Now, so far also we cannot see any cracks inside the regime. Maybe they're invisible, but at least not outwardly we cannot see them. Now, the regime has built a broad and a very efficient system of coercion. The Revolutionary Guards, Basij, and the Rohani Tezami, which are under tight ideological control of the clergy, and it's also proven its effectiveness and ruthlessness in suppression in recent years, from controlling the internet to using snipers to blind demonstrators. And based on these parameters, it appears that at the moment, the regime is not facing any danger of mass uprising or internal disintegration. I want to stress two factors that are unique to Iran in this model. Now, in the past, the bazaar, in the past 200 years, the bazaar played a very important role in all protest movements. But the bazaar, since the revolution, has lost its power for two major reasons. One, the Iranian economy has greatly modernized, and the role and share of the bazaar has declined significantly in the economy. Companies and industries that are controlled directly or indirectly by the government now dominate the economy, not the bazaar anymore. In addition, the regime managed to weaken the internal networks of the bazaars and co-opt them to various bureaucratic bodies. In other words, the bazaar networks now depend on cooperation with the government. The private sector is very small, and then the public sector, which is controlled by the state, and also part of the private sector is controlled by semi-governmental bodies like the Setad or the Chatham company, which means that the Iranian private sector it depends on the state. It is not an independent, powerful middle class or capitalist class. It is a capitalist class that is dependent on the state. Very similar to the situation that existed under Reza Shah. Now, they are dependent on the state because they need government contracts, allocation of foreign currency, and import permissions. And therefore, such people are unlikely to revolt, unless, again, the situation may become desperate. Now, there are, of course, other factors which have been discussed in the webinar today and yesterday. They point to weak points of the regime, potential threats. And here the crucial point is the question of what we call in political science opportunity. That is the moment where people feel or believe that the regime has weakened and they are more powerful than the regime. The moment that they sense cracks or weaknesses within the regime, and that emboldens them to act. This has happened in Iran in 1977 with the switch from economic boom to recession. It may happen in Iran, but we have not seen it yet. The point here, this is a psychological element that cannot be predicted in advance, neither by the people themselves nor by outside observers. Therefore, for the time being, the regime seems powerful. Now, I believe, and as some of the speakers mentioned, Professor Milani and others, that yes, time is working as the regime. Eventually, in the long run, this regime will change. But this change could happen soon. We have surprising history, but it could also take 15 years or more, or let me conclude by the Arabic saying, God knows best, Allahu A'lam. And with this, I will conclude my remarks. And let me, again, we're concluding the webinar. Let me thank all the participants in the webinar who have been able to mobilize them and list them in a very short notice for their readiness to devote the time and effort for the webinar. Let me also thank the younger people who are behind the scenes making this webinar possible, Eyal Busilovsky, Liam Sadowski, and Shira Cohen. Without them and their technological skills, we could not have been able to produce this webinar. And I want to thank all of you for taking part in the webinar and for contributing to it. And hopefully we'll have future webinars, hopefully one that will explain why Iran has become a democracy and the new Sweden in the Middle East. So thank you very much and hope for happier times for all people in the Middle East.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.